There is something strange about the old Appalachian winter records, something that doctors and historians who study this era notice and struggle to explain. In the lowland towns, in the valley settlements, in the growing cities along the eastern seaboard, winter brought sickness the way it always has. Coughs that settled into chests and stayed for months. Fevers that took children in the night. Illnesses that moved through families like water through dry ground, touching everyone, sparing almost no one. But deep in the mountain hollows, something was different. The families who lived far up in the ridges, the ones most isolated, most removed from the roads and the towns and the commerce of the outside world. These families seemed to move through winter with a quiet resilience that nobody could quite account for. They got cold. They worked hard in brutal conditions. They lived in small spaces through long, dark months with very little of what modern medicine would call health care. And yet, they endured. Season after season. Generation after generation. The mountain didn't make them invincible, but it gave them something, and they were wise enough to use it. Understand first what these families were facing. Winter in the southern Appalachians, in the deep hollows of Kentucky and West Virginia, and the high ridges of North Carolina and Tennessee was not a gentle season. It arrived without apology and stayed without hurry. The cold came down off the high peaks in November and settled into the valleys like something heavy. The sun cleared the eastern ridge for only a few hours each day. Firewood had to be split and carried in bitter wind. Water had to be drawn from springs that sometimes frosted at their edges overnight. The body was under constant stress. Cold air, physical labor, reduced sunlight, close quarters with other family members through months at a stretch. Every condition that modern medicine associates with increased illness risk, these families lived inside all of them. Every single winter, for generations. And yet the ones who knew the old ways, who had inherited the mountain's medicine along with the mountain's land, they endured in ways that still deserve our attention, because what they were doing wasn't luck. It was a system, built not in laboratories, not in medical schools, built in the hills themselves, across generations of watching what kept a family alive. The first thing to understand is the food. Winter in the mountains didn't mean eating less. It meant eating differently. The fermented foods that filled the root cellar, the sauerkraut, the pickled vegetables, the lacto-fermented beans and cucumbers that mountain families had been preparing since late summer. These weren't just preserved food. They were living food, packed with beneficial bacteria that modern science now calls probiotics, organisms that quietly support the body's immune function in ways researchers are still working to fully understand. The mountain families didn't know that word, didn't need it. They knew that the families who kept a good crock of kraut through winter stayed healthier than the ones who didn't. They knew that the sour brine left at the bottom of the pickle jar was worth drinking on a cold morning, not throwing away. They knew these things the way they knew everything in these mountains. Through watching, through generations of careful observation, through the accumulated memory of what worked and what didn't. The gut, as modern medicine is slowly rediscovering, is deeply connected to the immune system. Feed it well through winter, and the winter has less power over you. But the fermented food was only part of the picture. Walk through an old Appalachian cabin in January and look at what hangs from the rafters. Not decoration, medicine. Bundles of dried elderberries, dark and dense, harvested in the last warm weeks of autumn before the first frost took them. Elderberry had been used in these mountains, and in the cultures that the mountain settlers brought with them across the ocean, for longer than anyone could trace. A tea brewed from dried elderberries on the first sign of a cough or a cold was as standard in the mountain household as putting wood on the fire. Modern researchers studying elderberry have found compounds in the fruit that appear to interfere with the ability of certain viruses to replicate inside the body. Not cure, not magic, but a measurable, documented effect that the mountain families had been using for generations before anyone in a laboratory ever looked at it twice. Bundles of yarrow hung beside the elderberry. Used for fever, for the kind of deep winter cold that settled in the chest and wouldn't move. Wild ginger root, packed in dry sand in the cellar, ready to be grated into hot water on a bitter morning. A warming herb that the mountain people understood intuitively promoted circulation and eased the body's response to cold. Spicebush berries, dry boneset, black cohosh root for the deep aches that came with winter illness. The mountain cabinet of winter medicine was not random. It was centuries of accumulated wisdom about which plants, taken at which time, helped a body move through the cold season with its strength intact. Not every remedy worked the way the mountain people believed it worked, but more of them worked than modern medicine spent very long assuming. There is another piece of this story that almost nobody talks about. The mountain families moved. Every day, without exception, in weather that would keep most modern people indoors staring at a screen. Wood had to be split, water had to be carried, animals had to be fed and tended, the cabin had to be maintained, the root cellar had to be checked. Fences needed mending even in February because the cattle didn't care what month it was. The mountain winter demanded constant physical work from every member of the household, old enough to contribute. And that physical work, that daily movement of the body in cold air, did something that no herb and no fermented food could replace. It kept the blood moving. It kept the lungs working hard and clearing themselves. It kept the body warm from the inside in a way that sitting beside a fire, however necessary, simply cannot. Modern researchers studying cold weather exercise have documented what the mountain families discovered through necessity, that moderate physical activity in cold conditions, far from being harmful, can actually strengthen the immune response. The mountain didn't give these families a choice about moving. And in not giving them a choice, it gave them something they couldn't have bought. The herbs and the food and the movement were real. But there is one more element that runs through every account of old Appalachian winter life. Something harder to measure, harder to name. The preparation. The mountain families didn't enter winter unprepared and hope for the best. They spent the entire year, spring, summer, autumn, building toward the cold season the way a soldier builds toward a battle he knows is coming. The root cellar was stocked before the first frost, not after. Before. The herb bundles were dried in August and September when the plants were at their most potent, when the oils that held their medicine were concentrated by the summer heat. The elderberries were harvested in that narrow window between ripe and gone, a window that lasted sometimes only a week or two, because the mountain families knew the calendar of the wild things around them the way modern people know the calendar on their phone. They knew when the spicebush berries turned red. They knew when the black cohosh root was ready to dig. They knew when the yarrow was at its height and when it had passed. This knowledge wasn't written in any book these families owned. It was written in the landscape itself. And reading that landscape, being present in it, attentive to it, moving through it with eyes open through every season of the year, was its own form of medicine. A person who knows when the elderberries ripen never misses the elderberries. A person who has spent August in the hills gathering and drying and preparing never faces January empty-handed. The mountain families didn't get sick less because they were stronger than modern people. They got sick less because they had spent 9 months making sure that when sickness came looking, it found a house that was ready for it. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over an Appalachian hollow in February. The snow lies deep in the north-facing coves where the sun never quite reaches. The creek slows under its ice. The bare ridge lines stand against a white sky like something drawn in charcoal. And in the cabin, small, warm, smelling of wood smoke and dried herbs, and the faint tang of fermented brine from the crock in the corner, a family moves through the deepest part of winter. Not without difficulty, not without cold fingers in the morning and aching backs at night, but alive and well, and carrying inside them the accumulated wisdom of every winter their people had survived before them. The old Appalachian families didn't have pharmacies. They didn't have doctors most of the time. Didn't have supplements and bottles with recommended daily allowances printed on the side. They had the mountain. And the mountain had given them, over generations of close and careful living, exactly what they needed to survive the season it also brought. Elderberries that ripened in September. Springs that ran cold and clean through stone, soil that grew the fermented food that fed the gut, that steadied the body against everything the winter could throw at it, and the knowledge, old, quiet, patient knowledge of how to use all of it. That knowledge is mostly gone now, scattered, forgotten, replaced by things that work differently but not always better. But every spring that still runs cold out of an Appalachian hillside, every elderberry that still ripens in September along the old fence rows, every patch of yarrow still growing in the high meadows where the old families used to walk, is the mountain's way of saying that the knowledge is still there, waiting for anyone willing to learn it again.